episode 83 of the Space Policy Show. I'm your host, Jordan Bingham. In today's episode, Making the Moon a Reality, we'll talk to Kaitlyn Johnson, Deputy Director and Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and her look ahead at the next 10 years of planned missions for lunar and cislunar development, and what it all means. She's talking with Dr. Angie Bukley, Senior Policy Analyst from Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Over to you, Angie.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jordan. It's a good thing. It's good to be here. Kaitlyn, it's really great to have you with us today. And congratulations on your paper, Fly Me to the Moon. You've done a great job covering the global and Cislunar and Lunar missions from pretty much everybody that's involved. So let's start with the basics and have you tell us the definition of cislunar space.
Start off with one of the hardest questions I had to research, huh? Yeah. Angie, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk with you about this. One of the key pieces to this report, which unfortunately, like I said, was one of the hardest, was to find a definition of cislunar space in like an internationally accepted, technically informed way. What I found instead was a lot of competing definitions that came from a variety of different sources, none of which really talked to one another and none of which really seemed to me to be very technically informed. As a space policy professional, not an engineer or an astrophysicist, I did reach out and consult a lot of those engineers and astrophysicists to see what they thought. Got in a lot of discussions about the solar system and the magnetic sphere and the gravitational pull when satellites are in between the Earth and the moon. And what I ended up coming up with and kind of set forth for my paper was a definition that included beyond geostationary orbit out to the moon and a little bit past. It is not the best definition, but it was the best that I could do at the time. And one of the conclusions from this work and this research is that we need a better definition for cislunar space that's internationally recognized and technically informed to be able to start having more solid conversations.
Yeah. So how do you think we might get there to an internationally accepted definition? Do we try to do something through the UN, through other types of organizations? What do you think about that?
I would love to see this as a place where the policy and technical communities come together to sort out what physically could be included as cislunar space and then politically what makes sense. I think you could pursue that in a couple ways. It does not have to be, in my opinion, like written into UN law, but it could be adopted by the UN in different ways. It could be written into multilateral agreements like the Artemis Accords that deal with issues of cislunar space and the moon, just so that we have a common language when we're talking about this impressive amount of development that we're going to see in the next 10 to 15 years that I lay out in the rest of the paper.
Right. Yeah, I've read a lot about cislunar space and development in cislunar space, and there are, it depends on who you're talking to as to which cislunar space they're actually talking about. So yeah, I think it would be really it would give everybody, the same reference point to have one definition. But right now we have many, so we'll just work with it until that gets sorted out. So why do you think countries are planning so many missions and operations in cislunar space these days? Is it science, economy, just what?
I think what we're seeing is this amazing opportunity that space has afforded both traditional space actors, but also new countries and companies. And it's now moving beyond low Earth orbit. It's moving beyond even geostationary orbit. It's going out into cislunar space and to the moon to be able to capitalize on a couple different things. Uh, as I lay out in the paper, one of the most popular kind of mission set is based on science. And a lot of this is driven by nation states like the United States and NASA, or the Chinese Space Agency, Roscosmos, the European Space Agency, all to invest in our knowledge and understanding of the moon, cislunar space, to search for ice and water, things that really will go into developing a better understanding so that we could possibly have sustainable human presence on the moon and in deep space. I think there's a bit to say about um, the growing space economy and how companies as well are seeing cislunar space as that next step and another place to capitalize on new missions and new technologies, develop workforce. But also we have a couple of really great programs coming out of some of these space nations to support commercial services um, within their own country. NASA does this really well with a couple of different programs to help place science missions or other technologies onto um, lunar landers, which NASA also funds, and then also place those onto rockets to get them there. All of this facilitated to continue building that presence um, to the moon. And lastly, I think you can't ignore national prestige. I mean, we saw with the Apollo era and the ripple
Mhm.
effects from that what going to the moon can mean for humankind and the kind of innovation it can inspire both in technologies created but also in people and in the future and in education as well. And I think we are at a time in space place right now that countries are looking to do this again and to have another push, but instead of it being driven by international competition like it was during the Cold War, it's really driven by other factors like the search for more information and knowledge, this workforce development and economics, and then as well as all culminating in kind of national prestige.
Right. And there's also the strategic value of having assets in cislunar space and uh, also other types of missions to support an eventual human presence on the moon, for sure. I was really impressed reading your paper at how many missions are being planned. You broke it down into regions and countries, and I guess I never thought about how many efforts were ongoing right now. Um, from your perspective, having done the research, do you see any of these missions or activities as perhaps transformational with respect to cislunar space development and exploration?
Yeah, I was also surprised by just the sheer amount of effort going into cislunar space and the moon. I mean, it's an incredible movement worldwide, not just from the big 3 space countries. I mean, obviously, we have some pretty impressive plans coming from the United States, China, and Russia to go back to the moon to further develop cislunar space. But we see incredible partnerships with countries like Canada, Australia, the the European Space Agency has partnered with all 3 of these big traditional space nations. And then we see just an incredible amount of national enterprise coming from nations who might not have such a sustained presence in low Earth
Mhm.
or geostationary orbits, like the UAE, Israel, even Thailand. And so I think when we talk about what kind of work would be transformational, um, to me as a policy expert, this is really based on kind of the coordination of all of these lines of efforts to build more long-term sustainable transportation and logistics in cislunar space or on the moon. So building up to that. And so I see a lot of these programs that we expect to launch in the next 5 to 10 years as being foundational for some of these bigger dreams. And this kind of understanding and this really the logistics system that we're building now is going to be that transformational change that enables greater discovery and greater opportunity to build further. Um, those kinds of things are things like the Lunar Gateway, which the United States is investing heavily in, but also what we like to call space domain awareness or space situational awareness in cislunar space. It is notoriously hard to track objects in cislunar space, and we can't use the same kind of nomenclature and the way of understanding relative to Earth that we use for satellites in near Earth orbits in the cislunar environment. So we have to come up with new ways of tracking and of identifying where objects are in cislunar space, which
Mhm.
I'm going to leave to the scientists and the engineers. But is that kind of stuff will be foundational and really transformational, even though it seems like such a first step. But I think that those kind of things will build how we discuss with one another where objects are, where they're going, and what kind of capabilities we can build on orbit to
Mhm.
ensure that kind of long-term strategic plan of having humans live and work in cislunar space or on the moon.
Great. So, when you were going through all of these different missions and looking at the international partnerships, of course, the United States partners with many nations, and but there are activities going on in which we're not a partner. So, are there any of those particular endeavors uh, that we should be paying close attention to?
Certainly, though, what I kind of saw in the research were almost like three congruent lines of effort. I really take an opposition to the way that many media sources in the United States have framed it as a space race. I don't really think that it's a race. As I talk about in the report, there are no competing missions that deadlines have changed or more money is being funneled into the projects in order to beat somebody else to this space.
Mm.
You also hear things like, the Lagrange points um, are strategically important and we must get there first. They're very large. It's not like you are claiming one tiny spot, and if you don't get there first, you're not gonna have access to this space. It's vast. And the moon is the same way. You could have multiple bases on the South Pole where we've identified water and ice, and work simultaneously. And so I think as we look at these three efforts, one from the United States, one from Russia, and one from China, we have to kind of frame them in this way that all three countries are really
Mhm.
investing in separately into different aspects that they find important. I think for Russia and China, we see some collaboration possibly between the two nations themselves. But
Mhm.
countries like ESA or organizations like ESA are working with all three nations, which is was pretty incredible. And to me, signaling that this is not um, you know, one side versus another or three against each other. It's really could be a better example of international collaboration for greater scientific and engineering means. I'm
Right.
not sure I really
Thank
answered
you.
your question.
Um, I did well. There've been a number well, there are a number of developments ongoing in the US right now. I mean, you've mentioned already the Artemis program, and also there's a program that NASA is also in charge of. It's the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, or CLIPS, where they're taking US-based company payloads as well as NASA payloads to the surface of the moon to learn more about the environment and so forth. And the Space Force has, announced some time ago their plan to develop the Cislunar Highway Patrol System, or CHIPS. And we also have the Gateway, like you mentioned before. The Artemis Accords are playing a big role. They were signed back in October of 2020, and I think originally there were 8 countries that signed the accords, and now we're up to 16. So that's a big group of countries that are working together. Cooperation, we all know cooperation is hugely important with regard to space missions, because some of these missions are just too big for one country to manage. And that I know that we don't really work with China uh, closely or at all. And does that put the United States in a position where they might actually miss out on some really important scientific discoveries or infrastructure development or communications and navigation systems because well, NASA really can't talk to China? I mean, are we gonna miss out on anything? Just from the research you've done, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of really important points. Um, first, that the Wolf Amendment, in my opinion, is a shame that we are holding ourselves back. When you look at the history of the amendment, of why it was adopted, and the effects it was intended to have, which is to basically punish China for human rights abuses, it hasn't really stopped that. And in reality, it's handcuffed ourselves to being able to work with China on space missions. Science and technology is such a ripe area to grow international collaboration and trust. We've seen great cases of this in the past with the Soviet Union and the United States. And there's no reason to think that we couldn't build a similar respectful relationship with China. We have worked with China a little bit in the recent years, especially with their lunar mission. Um, but as you brought up, some of the infrastructure that is going to be needed for cislunar space to make it sustainable, things like communications, as we talked about, SDA, but also navigation. Um, those
Mhm.
systems, if they were open access and international, could be, I think, much more effective than having competing systems like we do in those systems that we see here on Earth today. When you think about the different position, navigation, and timing systems that the Russians, Europeans, the United States, and the Chinese all have, having something for cislunar space that's really international could be beneficial. And it's, as you said, it's expensive to go to space. And
Mhm.
I think this international collaboration will both help with that, but also would help build that common language and understanding and trust, at least in one avenue, as we all continue to have similar, dreams of working and living in space and on the moon. And so, personally, I think the Wolf Amendment should be repealed, and I know there are a lot of people in the space community and the space policy community in DC who have advocated similarly. Um, but there are other ways around those kind of restrictions, and we need to maybe be a little more aggressive in finding them. And even if it's an extra step or two to making sure that we continue to build this relationship with China, as well as continue our longstanding relationship with Russia and Roscosmos as we retire the International Space Station and move on with the Gateway.
Yeah, those are all good points. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we might be able to overcome this barrier of communicating with China, because that's, as you said, uh, we've really handcuffed ourselves there. And I know the Wolf Amendment plays a big role, and if that could be overturned or rescinded, that would be helpful. But are there other things that we can do given the constraints um, to have better insight into what China is planning and what their military or national space security plans might be with regard to working in the domain of cislunar space.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and it's challenging. The Wolf Amendment does not fully prohibit the United States and NASA from working with China. It just limits those activities and requires, I think, like a check through Congress, basically. So I think there are avenues to continue to pursue. The Chinese brought back lunar samples and have started to share them with, international scientists. We obviously have our own lunar samples that we've shared widely. So starting to continue to build those relationships as well. I would also think that, maybe working with the European Space Agency could be a great way to gain more insight and to build more commonality with the Chinese. The European Space Agency is committed to working with the Chinese on their missions to the moon, as well as working with Russia. So, really leaning on our partners and allies to help us facilitate this communication, I think could be a really great avenue as well. Um, the strategic and military part of your question is really challenging, obviously. When I was doing this research, part of what I wanted to see was how much military activity is there in cislunar space, how much interest is there, especially with kind of the attitude that some in the United States have taken that China is racing to gain strategic value in the moon, and so we therefore should beat them there. And I wanted to see how much truth there was to that. I think, if you read the report, there's not much that I could find in the public information about what China is pursuing or Russia is pursuing from a strategic and military sense towards the moon. But I imagine that there is some stuff there. But what's been really interesting is to see just how much more I could find about the United States and our goals. Obviously, you mentioned that the Space Force has been interested in cislunar space. Some of their foundational documents, like the Space Power document, specifically calls out cislunar space, which is kind of to me, a turn in shift in focus as well. Something new that we hadn't seen before. You mentioned a couple of other programs that the U.S. military and DARPA are pursuing for cislunar space as well. We're also investing in things like lunar intelligence gathering, knowing what systems are in cislunar space and what they're doing and where they are. But I haven't yet seen the same kind of rhetoric coming from Russia and China about the strategic importance of the moon or of certain, like the Lagrange points, certain stable points in cislunar space that I've seen from the U.S. government, as well as kind of, independent scholars who are affiliated with the Air Force or the Space Force, for example.
So, Kaitlyn, if we look at international commercial cislunar initiatives, from your report, you identified the fact that there are 24 out of the 106 ongoing cislunar endeavors that commercial entities are actually leading. And in fact, in Israel and Turkey, commercial entities are leading the way with their efforts to explore and develop cislunar space. We've seen a much higher emphasis, both in our civil space programs and Space Force and the military, to leverage commercial assets. So, what steps do you think we can take to increase even more the inclusion of U.S. commercial assets in the overall military and national security space strategic planning as we move out into this region of cislunar space?
I mean, isn't that just so exciting though? Like 1/4 almost of the missions I found were commercially led. To me, it really is showing that it's not a domain ruled by nations anymore. And we're seeing this in near Earth space, like low Earth orbit, with what SpaceX is doing with their Starlink constellation. They're operating more satellites than most nations. And I love that that kind of energy has carried into cislunar space, because to me it signals that companies and investors really see space as a good return on an investment and are willing to put in the time and money to develop that workforce, to develop new technologies, to make a more sustainable presence in cislunar space or on the moon than if it was solely led by nations. I was really excited to find that a couple of those nations in my report were mostly led by commercial. You mentioned Israel and Turkey, but there's also a lot of really good commercial companies in Japan, for example, that are
Mhm.
making significant pushes into cislunar space and to get to the moon. And so to me, it just is a really exciting time to see these missions being planned, and then hopefully they'll come to fruition in the next, 5 to 10 years. When we think about the United States and how we internalize our own commercial space, um, efforts and how we partner with the US government on those. Um, NASA has had great success so far in doing that with a lot of programs, and we mentioned one of them earlier, the CLPS program from NASA that puts commercial payloads or missions onto commercial landers often, and then onto
Mhm.
commercial rockets, which is all um, building a more sustainable ecosystem for us to be able to better invest in space. And for the military, I think the Space Force is really recognizing that this is an issue for them to invest in as well. And we see that with a lot of the conversation surrounding procuring commercial services, especially in common military missions like intelligence gathering. So, procuring data
Mhm.
from companies like Planet to supplement what the NRO collects, for example. And I think we can do similar things. As we talked about, the US military is very interested in cislunar space, and a lot of these commercial companies
Mhm.
are already building sustainable platforms to get there. And so I think there's an easy way to leverage that capability and technology rather than having the Space Force reinvent the wheel in house, um, especially when we're in this kind of really early foundational setting. Now, there are certainly missions that the US military is going to want to invest in independently of commercial companies and really own those satellites and operate them themselves versus contracting out to a service or a commercial company. But I think with the lessons learned that we have with other space programs, we can really leverage those with commercial space and not have to start over, for example.
Yeah, awesome. I'm really excited about these developments, particularly at how capable some of these commercial platforms have become. And, I think back, 10 or 12 years ago when NASA actually started looking at the launch services program, the commercial crew program. The whole idea there was to pull commercial industry into the mix, and NASA, funded SpaceX, quite heavily, but it's really opened the door to commercial launch programs and things like that. So I think it's a good way, and I appreciate your bringing that up in the comments on it. Um, let's see. So you talked earlier about the planned initiatives that are going forward in cislunar space. Some people are saying it's a space race, but you also point out in your paper that it really doesn't point to some kind of space race with these competitive activities. It's really are seemingly competitive activities. It really isn't a competition. But as we move forward and communicate more openly with our allies and potentially with China and Russia, do you see the cislunar development as being kind of potentially a uniting force as things evolve? Or might it be a source of increased tension and competition?
I think the jury's really out on that. I think we could have a great impact in deciding that outcome, and we have to do that now because these types of relationships and conversations are built over years and decades of building trust. And so, if we decide to take the position of collaboration and of common goals for humanity and science, and investing in new technologies and really expanding, the possibility of what we can do, I think the United States, China, and Russia and others can start that conversation today and start building some of these foundational blocks to get there. I think you can see that a little bit
Mhm.
with the Artemis Accords. You can see that with um, Russia and China's willingness to partner with other nations as well. But there's obviously a contention between these big three space powers that we need to sort through. And I think, maybe I'm being an optimist, but, I think we can work through that in space. And maybe those ripple effects will extend to Earth as well.
Yeah, let's hope so. And even as the nations go forward with their plans for communication systems, position navigation and timing, let's at least hope they're looking at some sort of common standard so that at least they're they can be used by other nations, other endeavors. At least they'd be compatible. That would be the hope. Well, Kaitlyn, it's been a really interesting discussion. I'd just like to ask if there are any concluding remarks that you would like to add, perhaps something we didn't talk in detail about.
Yeah, well, I think our discussion covered, most of the report. There's obviously a lot of detail in there, and I spent a long time going through trying to find all the missions. I'm not sure I captured all of them, to be quite honest, but I did try. Um, as I was writing the last section on trends and missions, I think what really struck me and what was really challenging was defining which categories or type of missions different efforts fell into because often they were more than one. So you could have one mission that did both science and it had landing capability and it was also going to serve as a communications hub for future use. And it's just amazing to me the breadth of these missions and the capabilities that both nations and commercial companies are capable of today versus what we saw in the Apollo era where things were very segmented and we had to send a million different things to just do one mission. And these are much smaller, much cheaper and faster. And they're coming in from such a diverse range of nations and companies, that it's a really exciting time. And so I'm really hopeful for the next, you know, 5 to 15 years to see these missions launch and be successful and bring back this incredible data that we're and understanding that we're going to get, as well as kind of establish some of these stepping stones to build this better future.
Great. Well, Kaitlyn, it's been wonderful talking to you, and I agree with you on how exciting things are, particularly the capabilities that have developed in our commercial sector that, like you said, can serve multiple purposes. I kind of wish that I was a freshly minted engineering student looking for a job in the space sector right now because I think it's going to be very exciting, challenging. There's still a lot of issues to be resolved, and it's going to take a lot of smart people looking at that sort of thing. Not only the scientists and engineers, but also, the policy people, the legal policy, even business. Business models are changing. So But I just want to thank you. This was a great discussion. Appreciate your time, and I hope you had as much fun as I did.
Thanks so much, Angie.
Thank you, Kaitlyn and Angie. Don't forget, you can read the full research paper, Fly Me to the Moon, Worldwide Cislunar and Lunar Missions at CSIS.org. Our executive producer is Colleen Stover, and our technical director is James Liggins. You can find more of our shows at csps.aerospace.org, or check us out on Twitter using hashtag #TheSpacePolicyShow. We look forward to having you tune into our next episode.